another thing that people have taken as a given that seems to be, that could possibly be a complete fabrication. It might be another offshoot of this Mason's plan to just siphon off a bunch of money from the space program, but also siphon a bunch of money from the nuclear weapons program, because it seems like, and this was only brought to my attention through you and your post about it and the footage that you've shown, it seems like at least the test footage that we've seen of a lot of nuclear weapons from back in the day when they're telling our parents to duck and cover under their school desk to protect them from a nuclear blast, and you got the air raid sirens going off. Obviously, our entire culture was completely paralyzed by the idea of nuclear weapons. But when you're looking at the test footage, given back then it might not have looked fake. You know, back then they actually thought King Kong looked real in the movie, or Jaws looked real in the movie, but now we can see it's clearly fake. When you look back at that footage, it's oftentimes, it looks like the scale of, say, a subdivision where you're in an empty lot across the street aiming a camera at a farmhouse on the other side of the street, a lot over, and then the blast hits and the farmhouse just gets destroyed. The house just gets ripped apart. But what happened to the camera? You know, who's filming that? The camera is only a couple 100 feet away from that. And in some videos, man, this is the most compelling, is the blast comes from behind the camera. What the hell is that? The blast comes from behind the camera and the house gets blown away out into the background of the shot. And you're like, what kind of camera in that day and age could survive that blast, but an entire building can't? I mean, it seems way out there. You've changed my mind on a little of this. You've dipped my needle further into the fringe for sure.
Yeah. So it's just another way to get us scared into giving them more money. So we're giving them hundreds of billions of dollars in this space race that America and Russia were doing, and they also did the Cold War. So they scared us into this nuclear scare, and then stole a bunch more money to build fake nuclear weapons. And so, yeah, the nuclear weapons don't exist as such. The tests that you've seen, the very early ones, like you were talking about, are clearly fake, just done on models. Some of the later tests were done using stacked dynamite. You just get a shitload of dynamite and blow it all up, and it makes the mushroom cloud, does the whole thing. And what they'd do is they'd tell one team that, you know, they'd have a bunch of people 20 miles away, say army guys watching, doing the test, and then you've got over on one island these people stacking dynamite, saying that we're doing this for comparative purposes, and the real nuke's going to be over on that island. Meanwhile, they got another team over on that island stacking dynamite for comparative purposes, and the real nuke's going to be on the other island. So they even have military men stacking dynamite that they know is being used for these supposed nuclear explosions, but they believe that they've seen a real nuke, even though they tell them to cover your eyes and put your head in your laps as it happens. They don't see anything until the smoke clears afterwards. But yeah, a lot of military men will swear, you know, up and down that nukes must exist because they were there at some of those tests, and it's just dynamite. They do it beneath water by stacking dynamite in submarines, and you can do it up in the air as well. The Hiroshima and Nagasaki nukes, you can see that they're clearly two superimposed explosions, one on top of each other. There's two smoke plumes made to look like they're one. I actually used this technique several times. If you look at this nuke footage, there's if you go to my website, Nuclear Weapons Do Not Exist, you'll see these 3 documentaries that expose the thing completely. And so not only do so for instance, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, what happened is that they were firebombed. So the cities were leveled just like Tokyo was firebombed, and the damage is comparable. But they claim that it all happened from one blast. But this is clearly not true, because flowers and plants started growing within a month, and they say nuclear radiation would exist for hundreds, thousands of years and would cause birth defects and everything. But nowadays, Hiroshima's a bustling city, everyone's living there, everything's growing there, radiation's not a problem. There is some radiation after any explosion, so you would be able to go there with a Geiger counter and get some radiation, especially right afterwards, but it dies down quite quickly. And nuclear power, one of the most prominent nuclear physicists in America, he's dead now, Galen Windsor. He was involved in setting up most of the nuclear power plants in America. And he went all over America for years giving this lecture about how nuclear power is just the most expensive and effective way to boil water, and they're essentially steam plants, and that's all it is. The nuclear component that supposedly causes all this radioactive waste that needs to be, hazmat dealt with, and they drill holes into bedrock and put the nuclear waste deep under the earth, and they've got all these crazy regulations. He says, when we were first working with nuclear material, uranium, plutonium, we held it in our hands, and if some of it got hot, we'd throw it in the water, and that was it. No problem. He said, I would bathe, I would swim in the pool there that we would throw the radiated metals into, no problem. People thought he was crazy. He started drinking a glass of water from it every day, no problems. And then in his lecture, he started eating radioactive waste. So you can see on YouTube, type in Galen Windsor, and he'll take out a Geiger counter, show you some radioactive material. He'll take it out of a tube, and they'll say, I've just caused an EPA, if the EPA was in here, we'd have to clear out this whole area for half a mile, and people would have to come in with hazmat suits, blah, blah, and then he puts it back in the tube, and there's some left over on his hand. So then he licks his hand, shows the waste on his tongue, swallows it, and says, I've been doing this for years. And so the idea is just another fear campaign. And that's why they get the military involved in all these nuclear power plants and the nuclear weapons. It's to siphon off money, keep us afraid, and keep us playing off one another. Everybody thinks that, Russia and America are enemies, and that the Cold War is real and the space race is real. But it's all just, they're all like WWE. It's like Hulk Hogan and Macho Man. They're all paid by Vince McMahon. They all go out to eat together. If you're high up in politics anywhere, for sure you're part of this brotherhood that controls everything. There's no independent man at the head of any state, and if he was, what's he doing? The only type of government that should exist is a government that doesn't tax or perform violence on its people. So the only kind of candidate I would vote for is someone who's for the abolition of all taxes and legislation other than common law. If you hurt or harm a person or their property, theft or breach of contract, those three things, those common laws, are the only things anyone should ever have to go to court for. Everything else is a victimless crime, and this is the big system that they get us caught up in. So they've got millions of statutes and acts that supposedly ignorance of the law is no excuse. So if you break any of these millions of legislations, they've got reasons to fine you or kidnap you and put you in jail, or even murder you if you don't pay them up. So I don't vote. I don't recommend voting. If you could get out of paying taxes, I'd recommend that too.
Wow. Well, man, this has been super fascinating. Doing a show like this once a week, sometimes it gets pretty hard to rattle me, pretty hard to get me excited for a topic, but this has done it.
Do nuclear bombs exist? Your immediate answer is yes. But how do you know? During the mid-20th century, television and movie watchers were bombarded with imagery of what was purported to be atomic test footage. But what were they really watching? They couldn't rewind a videotape or rescan through a video on their computer. So what option did they have but to accept these images at their face value? Now we have opportunity to scrutinize these images to see if they hold up to analysis. Take a look at these trees. Now what was that? And who turned the camera? They're in awfully straight lines, aren't they? Now this must be a different blast because it's coming from a different direction. Wait, now they've put it back. But those are the same trees we saw in the first clip, aren't they? And now this. First they showed us these trees that they panned left on. Then they show us these trees that look like they should be next to a model train. Notice how straight the rows are. It looks artificial to me. Then they show us these trees again. Where's the forward camera? And then back to these trees again. And then they show us what looks to be a real forest that's been chopped down or torn down. Now take a look at this. It's footage of the first H-bomb test called Ivy Mike. Watch how it changes. That's a composite. Then it morphs into this. It looks like a completely separate explosion. Now take a look at the frame before the explosion and then the one after. These frames were cut together. Why? Then this frame was cut to this, which looks like the sun to me. It looks like they're zooming in on the sun. Maybe a composite because the clouds aren't moving. Then they introduced some sort of liquid. It looks like a laboratory concoction in composite with the sun. Next is Operation Dominic Fireballs in the Yukon. What does that look like to you? Watch it again. It's the sun. Now here's Operation Greenhouse. These guys are getting all ready to see what looks to be the sun again. The sun seems to start to expand. Maybe it's being zoomed in on. They worship the sun after all, Lucifer. So why wouldn't they use him as their greatest weapon? And who headed up the whole program? None other than J. Robert Oppenheimer of the Oppenheimer family, who is reputed to have been the original financiers who got the Rothschilds started in Frankfurt, Germany in the 18th century.
He should do his duty, and to impress him, takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds."
You're thinking, what about Hiroshima? Is that Hiroshima? Is that Hiroshima? That looks like Hiroshima, but it looks like it's been carpet bombed. Check out this image of Rotterdam. Was that a nuclear bomb? Now compare it to this image of Hiroshima. Actually, this isn't Hiroshima, it's Tokyo after firebombing in 1945. If you accept that FDR might have had foreknowledge of the bombing at Pearl Harbor, maybe you might want to leave room for the possibility that his propaganda machine might have created the myth of atomic bombs. There's no question that the powers that be have ballistics with tremendous explosive capacity. But this shot, for example, could easily be high-volume dynamite. And what are we looking at here? Take a look at this house again. Whatever was strong enough to blow it to smithereens wasn't strong enough to even shake the camera. And look how high up the camera position is. Are we looking at another model? Now look at this bus and this car. Whatever's blowing them up is not moving the camera. And this building seems to blow up from the inside. Everything gets blown every which way except for the camera. Except look in this shot, it seems to tilt up a little bit. Now this is one of my favorites. Watch the two guys behind the glass. Who's filming them? Isn't he being exposed to all that rocket fuel? Anyways, I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. If you're hell-bent on believing that they can blow up the world at the push of a button, then go ahead. But next time you hear a politician justifying the invasion of a country based on the fact that they supposedly have weapons of mass destruction, realize that they're not only lying about the other country supposedly possessing weapons of mass destruction, they also may be lying about the very existence of weapons of mass destruction.
Do North Korea have nukes? Are the Iranians still trying to build a nuclear bomb? Are we perpetually on the brink of thermonuclear war? The governments and the elites that control them have such a history of lying to the public, can we not assume we are not being told the truth? From the Titanic to 9/11, the public have been fed one pantomime after another. Can we not be forgiven for questioning nuclear weapons, perhaps their tallest of tales? All this time has passed and still no nuclear war. This is excused with the notion of mutually assured destruction, the idea that all supposedly nuclear-armed nations fear their own nuclear destruction too much to try to destroy another, and so we live in perpetual nuclear peace in a world of continuous conventional war. What if all war was a fraud, the banking elite controlling all sides, all playing for a draw, not trying to defeat their enemy, but controlling their populations with fear? Why not forget the weapons and simulate it all on computers?
It's a bluff, John. Call it off. No, it's not a bluff. It's real.
Hello, General Barringer. Stephen Falcon.
Mr. Falcon, you picked a hell of a day for a visit.
General, what you see on these screens up here is a fantasy, a computer-enhanced hallucination. Those blips are not real missiles, they're phantoms.
Jack, there's nothing to indicate a simulation at all. Everything's working perfectly.
But does it make any sense?
Does what make any sense?
Wouldn't it be cheaper and easier to pretend? Why spend all that money on weapons you know you are never going to use? When convincing your enemy or your public you've got them achieves the same ends. Would the elites want to endanger themselves with nuclear weapons, considering what they can supposedly do? Do they want to destroy the world, and hide underground in bunkers, or is that just what they want you to think? They haven't done it yet, and I wouldn't hold your breath. Why have lots of nukes pointed at each other? Why not just have one very big one each, powerful enough to destroy the world? Would it not offer the same protection? If nuclear weapons exist, why do they tell us? Why aren't they kept secret? Surely it would be the best way to prevent them from proliferating. They are so secretive about all their other weapon systems, like HARP, directed energy weapons, railguns and coil guns and rods of God or kinetic weapons. Real or not, nuclear weapons are weapons of propaganda, designed to fill the public with fear, through which the elites control the population of the world.
Is this a game, or is it real?
What's the difference?
Later in the morning,
Fermi and physicist Herbert Anderson donned white surgical scrubs and rode in 2 lead-lined tanks to ground zero. Fermi's tank broke down after only a mile, and he had to walk back.
Is there any reason they didn't want Fermi to see the evidence firsthand?
With a yield 200 times greater than the 100-ton test, the fireball created a crater nearly 1/2 mile across and fused the desert sand into a green glass still containing traces of radioactivity 50 years later.
Radiated dust and debris from the blast, fallout, would fall onto neighboring communities. At a few locations, detectors showed rises in radioactivity, but they dropped quickly.
Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
The explosions were mostly created using large towers of hundreds of tons of TNT. A short time before the Trinity test, they detonated such a tower of 108 tons of TNT. The Trinity test was probably a larger such tower, of 1,018 tons of TNT.
May 1945. The hot New Mexico desert seemed far from the ravages of war in Europe.
The trick relies on encouraging people to believe a big explosion is a massive one. With eyewitnesses, this is achieved through distance. From a distance, it is difficult to know how big an explosion is. Most will accept it as being as big as they are told it is. It was very big after all. The trick also relies on people's propensity to exaggerate when recalling experience. It would have been the biggest explosion any of them had ever seen, and so they are likely to tell anyone who asks that it was big, in fact very big. They are unlikely to play it down and say, well, it wasn't all that big actually. For many of them it would have been the most interesting thing that had ever happened in their lives, and so they would tend to big it up.
In order to accurately calibrate the instrumentation for the test, another test, one using only high explosives, was needed. A dress rehearsal of 100 tons of TNT was planned for. Hundreds of crates of high explosives were stacked on the platform of a 20-foot tower. Tubes of low-level nuclear material were scattered throughout the explosives to simulate the radioactive products of a nuclear blast. Everything was set to a scale to match the expected effects of the nuclear test shot. On May 7th, the high explosive was detonated. The orange fireball was seen 60 miles away.
How big is this explosion? How big you perceive it to be depends very much on how far you think it is away and what you have to compare it to. The myth of the blinding light that supposedly makes nuclear bombs distinct from conventional ones is achieved using floodlighting and possibly mirrors, and possibly through the burning of elements such as magnesium within the explosion itself. It is often illustrated to the public with shots of extreme shadowing, which can easily be created in a studio. Most witnesses will never actually see the supposed blinding light, as they were usually told to close and cover their eyes, and often to turn their backs. Often the illusion was reinforced with protective goggles and clothing. The footage is generally put together using footage of smaller explosions, without anything in shot to provide size comparison, mixed with footage of the sun, sunsets, and clouds filmed using time-lapse photography. There is little or no unedited footage provided to the public. Almost all of the footage has cuts, and often cuts away to shots of observers, or shots illustrating the supposed destructive force, and back again to the footage of the developing aftermath of the explosion, and then away again and back again. And so, the public rarely sees a so-called nuclear explosion complete in one continuous sequence. Mushroom clouds are not unique to so-called nuclear explosions. The illusion of nuclear weapons was also manufactured with the use of very large conventional bombs, fuel air bombs or thermobaric or vacuum bombs. Up close and from a distance they could easily be mistaken for mythical, much larger so-called nuclear bombs.
But it was one unique conventional bomb that was the climax of high explosives in Vietnam. Called Big Blue 82, it was a blockbuster that caused injuries for miles. At 15,000 pounds, a single bomb was the entire cargo for the journey into hostile airspace. Delivered from the hold of a C-130 cargo plane, the bomb was slowed by a parachute and drifted to its target. When it exploded, the crater was enormous and the destruction total.
You're about to witness the mother of all bombs. The massive Ordnance Air Blast Bomb, or MOAB, 10 tons of H6 explosive.
When they were testing it, people actually thought they were testing small-scale nuclear devices.
Plus, the psychological effect of the nuclear-style mushroom cloud is undeniable.
Good job.
Russian military has announced the testing of a vacuum explosive device that unleashes a shockwave with the power of a nuclear weapon, according to Russian scientists. U.S. forces have used a thermobaric bomb, which works on similar principles, in their campaign against al-Qaeda and Taliban forces.
The first and most obvious question people ask when confronted with the idea that nuclear weapons may be a hoax is, what about Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
While the scientists at Trinity site waited for the test in the New Mexico desert, the primary components of the gun-type uranium weapon were being hoisted aboard the cruiser Indianapolis. The ship set sail for the Pacific island of Tinian in the Marianas. A few weeks later, on August 6, 1945, a B-29 named Enola Gay took off in the early morning hours. Just after 8 a.m., it dropped the weapon named Little Boy, which exploded approximately 1,000 feet over the Japanese city of Hiroshima.
Boom!
The uranium gun weapon, or Little Boy bomb, was a simple design, and scientists were confident it would work without testing.
Designers considered a test prior to combat use unnecessary and impossible, since there was only enough U-235 for one bomb.
And so Little Boy goes into combat as an untested weapon.
In the past 24 hours, 4 heavily loaded B-29s have crashed on takeoff. Parsons' greatest nightmare is the catastrophic consequences of a similar crash, this time with a fully armed atomic bomb on board. Disregarding months of planning, he makes a last-minute decision to attempt the arming of the bomb in the air and not on the ground, something which has never been tried outside the controlled, sterile environment of the laboratory. Armed with just a screwdriver and a spanner, He spends hour after hour practicing the techniques required to arm the bomb in flight. The temperature inside the bomb bay soars to over 40 degrees, but he continues, even as his hands start to bleed. There is no room for error. The next time he does this will be for real, 31,000 feet up in the sky, exactly 2 hours away from the target.
This is padding the narrative in order to make the very dull story of dropping a bomb more exciting, and to sculpt it into a triumph against the odds. The footage of the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima appears to be two plumes of smoke filmed in such a way as to make it look like one larger plume of smoke.
"8:18. My God, what have we done?"
The damage to Hiroshima and Nagasaki is not consistent with one single blast. The damage is uniform. Wooden structures have been burned away. More substantial buildings remain, with roofs and other flammable parts burned. It is remarkably similar to the damage caused by conventional firebombing. In Hamburg, Darmstadt, Kassel, and most notably Dresden, firebombing was used in such a way as to create an effect known as a firestorm, where a fire attains such intensity that it creates a central column of rising hot air, inducing strong inward winds which supply oxygen to the fire, which significantly increases combustion. The better comparison to make is with Tokyo, where the construction of buildings was more comparable, and conventional firebombing led to a similar death toll, casualty figures, and damage. Japanese cities consisted mostly of wooden dwellings, and burned easily. Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Tokyo were destroyed by fire. This is not in dispute. It is claimed that in Hiroshima and Nagasaki that a singular atom bomb caused these fires. It is likely that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were firebombed in much the same way as Tokyo, and that the story of Little Boy and Fat Man is entirely fictional.
At 8:15 in the morning of August 6, Japanese time, the first atomic bomb hit an enemy target. The bomb was aimed to explode above 0 point, a spot in the city at the junction of the Motoiso and Ota rivers. The bomb was intentionally set to explode well above the 0 point to dissipate its radioactivity. Here is the pictorial record of the result. At 0 point, directly beneath the explosion, the soldier in the scene is pointing at the spot from which all damage to the surrounding area was measured in terms of distance from the center of the blast. Within a mile of 0 point, the devastation speaks for itself. But in these very ruins, Army cameramen have found and filmed pictorial evidence that tells in twisted steel and stone the effect of death-dealing atomic power. For example, this was the site of the main Japanese military headquarters. There were approximately 20,000 Japanese military personnel stationed here. They are among the missing. A lone concrete smokestack indicates where a bustling factory once stood. Reinforced concrete buildings seem to have withstood the explosion fairly well, the damage varying with their distance from 0 point. Within an area of a mile to a mile and a half, this type of building was the only type to withstand complete demolition and destruction. Here's a building that was actually knocked sidewise, giving you an idea of the force of the blast. The direction of the blast is graphically told by the slant of this parapet, a concrete wall. Etched in the stone base of what was the Russo-Japanese War Memorial are telltale lines, atomic handwriting for all to read. Another signpost of the direction and force of the explosion is blasted in the polished granite base of this statue. The light surface indicates the angle of the blast. 2/10 of a mile from 0 point. Many of the shattered windows pointed like skeleton fingers the direction of the atomic wind of death. On one side, blown in. On the other, blown out, with atomic tornado force. Inside, the flash burns on the chairs give eloquent testimony on the heat of the blast a mile from 0 point, which singed the mohair upholstery like a blowtorch. Hiroshima City Hall, which stood at an angle of 45 degrees to the direction of the explosion, had its doors and windows blown in, but suffered much less damage than buildings squarely in the path of the blast. The windows and doors offer mute evidence of the way the blast swept into the structures. The destructive circle within a mile from 0 point had a few notable exceptions, mainly reinforced concrete. On the edge of the area of greatest damage was a landmark, the Red Cross Hospital, which never ceased functioning, although it sustained damage. Today, it dominates the desert of a debris that was Hiroshima. Another notable exception to the general demolition was the Higashi Railroad Station in East Hiroshima, a mile and a half from the center of the blast. This building, however, suffered extensive damage. The twisted steel beams and concrete wall show the effects of the tremendous concussion. What's left of the Commercial Museum, within 2/10 of a mile of 0 point, also gives indication of the tremendous push of the explosion. The downward force of the blast turned the roof of the Commercial Museum into a reservoir. Amazingly enough, bridges did not suffer too badly at Hiroshima. This steel rail bridge, 1 mile from 0 point, had the side toward the explosion virtually blasted by flying particles, which removed almost all the paint. But the side away from the explosion did not need a new paint job. Roads in the area fared better than buildings or bridges. Shortly after the fires died down, traffic was resumed. Today, these highways through the ruins are again in use. Beside our military traffic trudge the survivors of vanished Hiroshima, the first city in history to be atom-bombed into oblivion.
It would be easy to ensure the bomber crews responsible for the firebombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki didn't survive the war. And it would be easy to convince people to lie, with bribes and with the idea that it is a noble lie that would bring an end to the war. Where is the big black scorch mark we saw from the bird's eye view of the Trinity site? It's all so much more dramatic when you add dramatic music.
Although Trinity had been a success, questions remained about Fat Man.
Three days later, another mission carrying the plutonium implosion weapon named Fat Man detonated over Nagasaki.
Cue the dramatic music. Hopefully by now you're beginning to see this for what it is, pure Hollywood.
The uranium gun weapon, or little boy bomb, was detonated over Hiroshima at an altitude of 1,800 feet, the height to achieve maximum blast effect. 3 days later, the Fat Man implosion bomb was detonated over Nagasaki. In Hiroshima, 70,000 people were killed or listed as missing. Of its 90,000 buildings, over 60,000 were demolished. The implosion bomb, dropped on Nagasaki, took the lives of 42,000 people and injured 40,000 more. It destroyed 39% of all the buildings in the city. With a yield of 20 kilotons, similar to that of Trinity, this weapon would be considered a nominal atomic bomb and provide a blueprint for all future nuclear weapons.
These skulls in the foreground are very illustrative. Throw in a nice emotive baby playing in the rubble. Burn victims are in no way evidence of nuclear detonation. Standard heat will cause burns. Burn victims are indicative of firebombing. Radiation is also not proof of nuclear detonation. Radiation can easily be faked. It merely needs to be claimed. But as we have seen from the TNT test at Los Alamos, radioactive material can be spread by conventional explosives, and so presumably conventional bombs. However, there is no significant evidence of any long-term radiological contamination of either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the American military proceeded to stretch the truth even further than they had before. Next came Operation Crossroads at Bikini Atoll. Crossroads consisted of 2 tests, the first codenamed Able, the second codenamed Baker. The supposed purpose of Crossroads was to test the effect of nukes on naval hardware, though many say it was a way of getting rid of surplus military ships left over from the war.
The bomb will not start a chain reaction in the water, converting it all to gas and letting all the ships on all the oceans drop down to the bottom. It will not blow out the bottom of the sea and let all the water run down the hole. It will not destroy gravity. I am not an atomic playboy, as one of my critics labeled me, exploding these bombs to satisfy my personal whim.
By dismissing the absurd, you can camouflage the ridiculous as plausible. Able, supposedly dropped from a plane, was likely a large conventional bomb.
The bomb missed its intended target by nearly 800 yards.
Baker, a much bigger explosion, was probably large amounts of submerged explosives. Soon enough the Soviets would begin to build their own fake nuclear bombs. August 29th, 1949. The Soviets faked their first atomic bomb. Making a device that will cause a nuclear explosion is one thing. Making deliverable nuclear bombs is a further challenge. Mass manufacturing these devices so that they can be stockpiled, ready for use as and when needed, brings with it further difficulty. It is not denied that nuclear weapons have a lifespan. This is good for the industry, as the need for periodical replacement generates ongoing revenue.
2 years after Crossroads, authority was given by President Truman to proceed with Operation Sandstone. devices utilized on Sandstone employed new technology to double the explosive force of the bomb, using the same amount of plutonium spent over Nagasaki. This technology met Department of Defense requirements for more efficient bombs and increased the ability to stockpile nuclear weapons. The results of Sandstone affected the design of future nuclear weapons, rendering the Mark III production components of the Fat Man bomb obsolete. The Mark IV and Mark V designs brought improved performance and lighter weight to nuclear weapons.
The purpose of Sandstone, and later Greenhouse, was to incrementally double and double again the power of these fictional bombs. At first by using the nuclear fuel more efficiently, and then by adding elements, primarily isotopes of hydrogen, deuterium and tritium. This would ultimately lead to the myth of the fusion bomb, many times bigger again. Also during this period, they would invent a way of utilizing U-238 within the bombs. Before they had wanted to maintain the idea that making nuclear bombs was very difficult due to the production method of plutonium and the separation method for U-235 being difficult, time-consuming and producing very small quantities with very high production costs. The use of ordinary uranium-238 was required to make it conceivable for them to continue making bigger and bigger bombs requiring more and more fissionable material, and to make a large number of them. It was also very convenient, as large quantities of uranium-238 were left over from the process of isolating uranium-235. Though uranium-235 and/or plutonium would continue to be an essential element of each fictional fission bomb.
A fourth test on Operation Greenhouse was the item test, about a 45.5 kiloton test in which tritium was burned in the very center of the nuclear explosion. And this process of putting tritium at the very center of the nuclear weapon is called boosting. And we kicked the yield up from about 20 kilotons to 45.5 kilotons, more than doubling it by that process. Another of the events on Greenhouse was the George event. Now George is a large 225 kiloton weapon that was used to burn a deuterium capsule. And this is the first of our thermonuclear weapon experiments to ever be conducted.
October 3rd, 1952. The British faked their first atom bomb. It was supposedly detonated inside the hull of a frigate, 8 feet 10 inches below the waterline. It was likely just a frigate filled with large quantities of explosives.
Dr. Penny gives the order for the weapon to be fired at 8 o'clock next morning. One scientist remains to arm the firing circuit. Connect the batteries. 1, 2. Next, the switches. 1, 2, 3. Now the key. Turning the circuit into position to fire. That's it. The weapon is ready to explode at the touch of control headquarters on an island some miles away. But it can't be fired before this man gets there, since he carries a safety link, and without that link the firing circuit is still open. Inside headquarters, the rest of the control party are waiting at their instruments. In the half-light of the control room, the safety link is delivered to the controller. The final process of firing can now be set in train.
Time bracket open. Fox George, this is How 1. Pass your message, over.
Hello, How 1, this is Fox George. Phase Saturn completed. Over.
Understand. Phase Saturn completed. Out.
Right. You can put the safety key in now.
Safety link in. Circuit complete.
Can we have the all-ready signals, please? Little Abercrombie, please. Thank you. Minus 8.5 minutes. Now.
Drifts well clear of the mainland, but it's still highly charged with dangerously radioactive water and mud.
Situated on the Zero Island was the cab, or building, which housed the device. The Mike device was known as a wet bomb, because it used liquid hydrogen isotopes to create the thermonuclear reaction. This made the device very large, weighing some 62 tons, and impractical to use as a deliverable weapon. A plywood tube ran from the Zero Island across the causeways to a detection station on the farthest island, a distance of nearly 2 miles. This tube was filled with helium, allowing lethal radioactive rays faster travel to the detection station before the island was consumed by the fireball.
A 2-story, 82-ton steel cylinder containing a concentric series of thermos bottles, which housed the super-chilled liquid deuterium, the hydrogen fuel, as well as raw uranium, tritium, Teller's plutonium spark plug, lead baffles, gold leaf reflectors, an ablative polyethylene lining, and, sitting at the very top of the assembly, a Nagasaki-style fission bomb to get it all going. The mechanism, along with its support and refrigeration gear, required a hangar-sized building called a shot cab to house it. The pipes leading off to the right were for observation purposes. They would carry the initial bomb light down a 2-mile wooden tunnel to sensors on a neighboring island. Cruiser Estes ordered the capacitors of the fission primary to simultaneously discharge into 92 detonators. The resulting shock waves raced through the high explosive shell, converging on and compressing the plutonium sphere into a supercritical metallic fluid, and crushing the tiny initiator at its core, releasing a few dozen neutrons to start the chain reaction. Million-degree X-rays outran the blast wave by milliseconds, racing down the radiation channels to immolate the interior plastic lining and send it crashing inward toward the plutonium spark plug suspended within the now superheating liquid deuterium. Pressure from the fissioning spark plug touched off a fusion reaction in the tritium at its core. The expanding shockwave met the inwardly rushing radiation to further compress the deuterium. Hydrogen atoms began to fuse, momentarily creating every element that had ever existed in the universe, and a couple more besides. A few millionths of a second after receiving its orders from the Estes, Mike had burst free of its thermos bottle and was heading for the upper stratosphere.
Fusion bombs were most commonly referred to as hydrogen or H-bombs. This may be because they have nothing to do with fusion of hydrogen into helium, but simply that in order to fake bigger and bigger bombs, the igniting of large quantities of concentrated hydrogen was required, rather than the towers of TNT utilized in the earlier fake fission bomb tests. In 1953, the Soviets faked their first so-called hydrogen bomb.
In the spring of 1953, the Atomic Energy Commission and the Department of Defense conducted 11 nuclear weapon tests in Nevada under the code name Upshot Knothole.
The first of the events, codenamed Encore, was a 27-kiloton nuclear device airdropped and detonated at about 2,800 feet to Grable, and it was delivered by the Army's new artillery cannon. A 280-millimeter projectile was fired and detonated over about the same blast area with a yield of about 15 kilotons at an altitude of about 500 feet.
As well as making their fictional bombs progressively more powerful, they would also push the idea that at the same time these fictional bombs can be progressively shrunk. They have gone as far as convincing the public that they can be fitted into a suitcase, and that you can fit up to 10 of them on the end of an intercontinental ballistic missile.
Castle Bravo, the largest device ever detonated in atmospheric testing by the United States. Bravo was a hydrogen bomb using solid thermonuclear fuel, confirming the designs of Edward Teller and Stan Ulam, and paving the way to producing aircraft-deliverable hydrogen bombs and more effective weapons.
Castle Bravo was supposedly a smaller device than Iron 9, though more powerful, though the building it was housed in was of a similar size.
Significantly exceeding its expected yield by 2.5 times, Castle Bravo, with an explosive power of 15 megatons, stripped islands clean of vegetation and took the scientists by surprise. The huge explosion released large quantities of radioactive debris into the atmosphere. This incident pushed the dangers of fallout from nuclear weapons clearly into the public mind. Almost 9 years had passed since the cancellation of the deep underwater test on Operation Crossroads. That test was finally conducted as Operation Wigwam.
Despite their initial size, they convinced the public with ease that fictional hydrogen bombs could be reduced in size sufficiently so that they could be dropped from aircraft or delivered by missile.
Operation Red Wing was conducted in the Pacific, primarily to test high-yield thermonuclear devices. Cherokee event would be the first delivery by U.S. aircraft of a thermonuclear weapon. This weapon would detonate with a yield of 3.5 megatons, almost 200 times the power of the Trinity device.
General Bernard A. Schriever is one of the first to suggest the H-bomb should be miniaturized to fit on an intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM.
In the fall of 1957, with test moratoriums looming on the horizon, 24 nuclear tests were conducted in the Nevada desert under the code name Operation Plum Bob. During Plum Bob, the Hood event would become the largest test ever conducted in the atmosphere within the continental United States. Hood, a 74-kiloton device, was suspended 1,500 feet above the desert floor on a balloon. While new weapon designs continue to be tested, the Department of Defense used the series to accelerate military training in nuclear warfare, while continuing its study of the effects from nuclear explosions.
Much of the nuclear testing was designed in such a way as to expose as many military personnel to the hoax as possible, so that they would perpetuate the myth by word of mouth, and so that as many people as possible would have an uncle or some other relative who was involved, and so would likely consider nuclear weapons a reality.
The 21st test, conducted during Operation Plum Bob, was the Rainier event. This was the first fully contained underground nuclear weapon detonation conducted by the United States. The 3-kiloton device was detonated 790 feet below Rainier Mesa, vaporizing rock into a molten bubble 100 feet wide. This technology would have great importance after the Limited Test Ban Treaty, which would prohibit all but underground testing of nuclear weapons and hide future experiments from prying eyes.
Underground tests are very easily claimed. For many, no footage is produced at all. Though it can be argued that underground you might better maintain a critical mass, it is likely that all underground tests are just as fake as those above ground.
During Operation Hardtack, the United States detonated 35 nuclear devices, as many as had been fired in all prior Pacific tests. By now, nuclear weapon tests were perceived in large part as saber-rattling, increasing the international tensions that could lead to all-out nuclear war.
They've pretended to drop them from aircraft, shot one out of a cannon, hung them from balloons, exploded them underwater and underground. Why not blast a few into space on rockets?
Teak, with a yield of 3.8 megatons, detonated nearly 50 miles above the surface of the Earth. The detonation created a violent magnetic disturbance in the atmosphere known as EMP, or electromagnetic pulse. This phenomena silenced radio transmissions for nearly 8 hours and damaged electrical circuits from Hawaii to New Zealand. Immediately following shots Teak and Orange in the Pacific, the United States conducted Operation Argus, 3 1-kiloton missile-borne tests in the South Atlantic.
The objective of the Argus experiment was to take a close look at the phenomena associated with the trapping in the Earth's magnetic field of relativistic electrons produced by nuclear detonations at very high altitudes. It was necessary to learn the governing parameters of these phenomena so we can make reliable estimates of their military importance. There seemed to be a good possibility that they were very important, and for that reason, there was a pressure on this entire operation to secure quick results.
A fleet consisting of 9 ships headed out for the South Atlantic. It is here that the Earth's magnetic field dips to its lowest point in what is known as the South Atlantic anomaly. 3 X-17A missiles are launched from the deck of the USS Norton Sound. The missile's 1-kiloton warhead detonates at an altitude of 300 miles. As Christophilus had predicted, charged particles from the detonation travel along the lines of the Earth's magnetic field, temporarily creating a new belt of high-intensity radiation. Where one of the most significant findings of Argus is that the detonation of a nuclear device in the ionosphere could create selective blackouts of radio communications.
Cactus event. This is a little 18-kiloton device that produced a crater about 137 feet across and 37 feet deep. Many years later, 1980, all of the fission debris and radioactive material on Inuitak Atoll was gathered up and dumped into the cactus crater, and then a concrete dome was placed over the crater to keep and to stabilize the radioactive material that had been contained in it.
They swept all the radioactive material under a dome-shaped concrete carpet.
By November of 1958, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union begin test ban negotiations in Geneva. With the exception of 3 French tests in the Sahara, the world is spared the rumble of atomic blasts for the next 34 months.
At Regan, deep in the Sahara, France goes forward with the detonation of her first atomic bomb, defying a United Nations resolution, the heated protests of Japan and most of Africa's newly independent nations, and the disapproval of both America and the Soviet. Since the autumn of 1958, Britain, the United States, and Russia have voluntarily suspended nuclear tests, and for 15 months have been trying to reach agreement on a formula to ban all atomic weapons development. Now, France presses forward with this first in a series of firings to force her way into the exclusive nuclear club. This first blast is on a level with bombs exploded over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II. The 150th nuclear weapon explosion in history carries France a step further towards General de Gaulle's dream of national glory restored.
Within 2 years, a dozen Atlas D missiles are deployed and operational. The first hardened squadron of Atlas launchers are turned over to the Strategic Air Command in August 1960. The missiles are deployed within blast-protected structures called